Hi guys, welcome to another tutorial video. This month we're going to be focusing on how to create jelly itself, the jelly-like effect that I use. So right off the bat, I'm just going to start with a quick sketch. I'm going to speed up some of this process because it actually takes kind of a while to do. One of the things I focus on while I'm sketching out jelly and trying to think of the shapes and forms is the way that gelatinous substances work, and that means, like I'm showing you here, no hard corners get turned, unless, in the instance of these little limbs, there's some overlapping happening. But by and large, I try to avoid pinches and hard right angles. Once that sketch is done, the first thing I move to is blocking in the color. Now the sketch I keep really loose, I just sort of get the general idea. This kind of gives me the opportunity to really refine what I'm talking about. And this is sped up as well, just to give you an idea of how long this actually takes. Here's this at real-time speed. I actually agonize kind of a lot over how smooth the transitions are, how the curves kind of flow into each other, making sure that nothing's too pointy. But I still want to get as much shape language and as much excitement out of the shapes as possible, so I'm going to speed that back up again. One thing that I'm doing here is making sure that even if things can be a straight line, that nothing really is. Everything's activated, which is sort of slightly curved or slightly showing a line of action or weight. So this bottom, for instance, could be just a flat straight line, but it has a slight sort of bean-shaped wobble to it. Straight lines sort of tend to defeat the effect of the depth and volume of jelly. So now that I have this at this point, I'm looking at the shapes and thinking, yeah, it's a little bit pointy up top. It's not quite as charming as I wanted it. So I'm adding a little bit of touch here and there. The shape flows out of the larger shape instead of sort of being stuck onto the outside. You can do that sometimes for sure, depending on the effect you want, but generally speaking, I want each bit and sub-bit of the jelly to flow out naturally of the form. The surface of a gelatinous object is actually quite taut, the surface tension is high. So every time it rounds a corner, there's kind of a gradient, a slope. The flow comes out of that. Those rounded edges come out of the fact that it's stretched quite tight. Right now I'm just blocking in the interior elements. I try to keep those on a separate layer, and I try to strategize based on what I'm doing, how the layering works. So for instance, these two little things at the top, the little tech bits, those are exterior pieces. They actually have two layers. There's the layer that's going to be sort of wrapping around and so obscured by the jelly. So I keep that on a separate layer with a darker color, so that once that's figured out, I can actually get in there, make it, right here I'll lower the opacity so that some of the blue of the jelly is affecting that. So it feels like the jelly is between sort of the tech that's sandwiching it. It's just a small window into just some of the thinking that goes into planning this out. I don't just shoot totally from the hip. I try to think of what's doing what in relation to the jelly so that everything stacks the right way. Here I'm just fussing with the little face. Again, it's good that I sped this up because it takes a while. I'm agonizing over the shape of the oval for his little sort of pixelated face screen. A lot of the process of pretty much anything I do, but especially jelly and JellyBots, is a lot about prep work. I like to set the table really thoroughly before I commit to all the effects and light. If I can set up those layers really well to begin with, meaning having the jelly separate from the interior elements, having a separate layer for exterior elements, and making sure each of those layers has the information I want. So now I'm adding some detail to those interior layers. That can all be on one layer because all of it's going to be set into the jelly together. So I'm just adding a little mechanical detail in the style that I've sort of found for the way that the tech works in jelly. If I set those layers up just right, then the later parts become much easier to handle. Sorry if this zooming around is getting anybody a little motion sick. I do that a lot. That's one of the great things about the iPad, is that you can twist it and turn it and come at it from a bunch of different angles really easily. And that allows my hand to inform, the way that my hand moves to inform the way that I draw, as opposed to me having to orient to a static screen. So now I'm going to do a little fakey pixel work here, a little smiley face. Just wanted this cute little gremlin bot to be about as appealing as I can make them for the purposes of this tutorial. I'm keeping this face element on its own layer as well, grouping those within a folder, keeping the jelly separate. The reason the little face is separate is because I wanted to make it glow. So now that I have the jelly in one shape that I like, now I can start looking at the color. What I'm going to fuss with first is this local color, which means the literal color the jelly is, not necessarily the light. So in this case, I'm adding a little bit of a faint green. Oops, too much there. Faint green across it, kind of harmonizing the colors together, finding a look that I like, kind of gradually painting into it. Key thing for jelly is with the colors, I like to keep everything as a soft gradient. The striping that I do on some of them was a new thing after I had thoroughly exhausted the big soft gradients, sort of smaller soft gradients, and I want to make sure, again, the jelly, the material itself, all the color and striping kind of spreads because it's sort of half liquid, so it's not going to have these hard dividing lines. So I'm going back and forth, smudging that, using a big soft brush to create those stripes, erasing them back out, trying to play with that so that they feel faded, kind of diffuse is the word. And I fuss back and forth with that until I get it right where I like it. What they help to do actually as well, because I had this single flat shape, they start to define how round and tubular the jelly is in that area. Once that's done, I collapse that into one layer. Now we have a stripy jelly. That's not quite all the color variation I want to do within this jelly, because he's got these little legs that are kind of, he's too chubby to get him on the ground. But I'm going to define those by using sort of a bluer hue. And here I'm going to paint in this little nubbin, sort of a diffuse glow to blend it into the body. But that pops it above the meat of his body just enough that you can kind of see where it is and tell where it is. I haven't gotten into light and shadowing yet. I really won't a lot, because the way that I abstract jelly with JellyBots doesn't involve a ton of sort of light play. You'd think it might, but it actually doesn't. It's mostly local color and shines. So often I'll stop and take stock. And now I'm looking at this. So the interior pieces, the way I'm choosing to do it on this version, I'm playing with the different layer modes. I look through them and I find that multiply is usually where I land. I set the whole tech bit layer to multiply and then lower the opacity so that it seems like it's set deeper into the jelly. But I want to give it some more dimension, so I'm using a copy of that set to overlay, which gives me a little bit of light, a kind of a light effect. And I'm erasing that to show the multiply version of the layer underneath it. I know that sounds complicated, but basically there's a lower opacity, bluer version of this underneath a lighter version of it that I'm erasing, so that it feels like the roundness of it, the parts that are closer to us, are sandwiched in less blue jelly. Does that make sense? So as it rounds out, as we go to the back of his little head, that's deeper into the jelly, so it's going to be darker, bluer, and more affected by it. Lighter parts of the little bicycle seat kind of mind amp up at the top there are closer to us, and so they're going to be a little warmer. Now I'm playing with a Gaussian blur glow on his little face. It's just a second layer with some Gaussian blur and the overlay layer effect applied. So he's feeling like he's set inside that jelly even without a lot of lighting, and it's time for shines. They're the best part. Shines are, it depends, it's always a mixture of hard edges and soft edges and finding the right shapes. Shines are the biggest tool I have in terms of showing you the dimension of the jelly and the flow of the forms and sort of proving that it's jelly, really. So with each sort of section of the shapes, I try and use a shine at the apex of that shape to show you a hint of the dimension. Each little nubbin limb gets a little highlight, and then I go in and I kind of use a softer brush to diffuse some of those highlights. Kind of gives you just a little bit more information about the roundness of his chubby little body. I'm sweeping that to the side. I'm erasing that back just a touch to get it just right so it's not too distracting. It's also, since that shine is in front of his little face, it shows you, reinforces the sense that he's sandwiched underneath and in the middle of a lot of jelly there. So once I've got those in a place, I'm going to show you. So the way I'm thinking of it and visualizing it with these lines here shows you that it's round and sort of tubular. There's a flow that these shapes have together, and there's sort of a general midpoint. Here, I'll show you here. So this line kind of shows you where the most sort of raised point of each shape will be, approximately. And seeing that, actually, I'm realizing that this little shiny on the top right could move in a little bit, sort of to wrap to that line to give you a clearer sense of the dimension. The highlights are always where the light comes in and hits the jelly at the point of it that is closest to the light. So that's usually the highest elevation relative to your light source. You know, that sounds complicated. It's the bumpiest bump gets the highlight. Now, the bubbles I add are set to overlay on a layer. And they're just these light little shapes that I brush in there. And they communicate and show you that the jelly has some depth, in addition to these shines that show you that it has a volume on the top. These show you that it has depth, and also help, again, by layering them in front of the tech objects inside, the characters. It shows you that those characters are swimming within a substance. So there's a kind of a use for each thing, and not everything is aimed at communicating realism. It's aimed to reinforce the sense of jelly. So now I'm ready to add a couple of use the overlay mode to add lighting effects to this. I'm using kind of a light green, kind of a warm color. See, if you look at the bottom of them, I'm brushing it in really gently. I'm sorry, there's no brush indicator, but I'm brushing it in gently on the other side of the shine. Because the way that jelly works is that the specular highlight, or the shinies, that's where the light's hitting hardest from the outside. But light travels through the translucent substance and reflects and bounces all around inside of it and kind of pools on the opposite side. So gemstones and jelly and things of that nature, you always have a highlight and then sort of a bounce light that's coming. None of the shadows are ever going to be very hard. Everything's kind of glowy all the way around it. I think I'll show you, diagram that a little bit right here. So here comes the light, it hits right there and gives you that brightest shine. It's actually a reflection of the light source here. Then it travels through the jelly, sort of bounces off the other side, and kind of is trapped in there. So it creates these zones that I'm circling where there's a little bit of glowy light. Now I try to use that gently because I don't want to distract. A lot of Jelly Butts specifically is about showcasing the design with as much clarity as I can manage. So I don't want to do anything so drastic and so high contrast that you can't still see the little guy's face and his little sort of robot bits inside. Now to finish it off, or at least to get closer, I'm adding a little bit of actual dark side shading In this instance, that means setting a layer to multiply and brushing that with a soft brush, keeping it very soft. Again, because of the nature of the substance, shadows aren't going to be very sharp. But I can use these shadows to show you a little bit about that, we call it interior detail. So this little nubbin that's not defined by the silhouette, but it is defined by some light and shadow across it. But even then, once I've got that in, I knock the opacity back and play with the saturation of the shadows and make sure that they feel like they're still light moving through them. They're not so thick and black that they feel like they're weighing down, or that the light that we talked about, that bounce light, isn't passing through them. Another word for this bounce light, the way that it works within a substance, is called subsurface scattering. So that's what we described when that light bounces around inside of it. It's kind of the same thing that happens when light shines from behind an ear, or you have a flashlight under your fingers. You're always seeing the light coming through, and you kind of can see the substance lit from within. So right here I'm demonstrating I can do a little bit of blurring. That's another option. I don't use it a lot on this one, but just to show the depth, I can take the internal objects and the areas that are further away from me, I can blur very slightly with a smudge tool or something similar. That also will help to set it and make it feel like it has a thickness. Here I'm just tweaking those shadows again with a little bit of saturation play. Here's flipping back and forth to show what I did with that overlay glow layer, and flipping those shadows set to multiply on and off. I'm gonna give his smile a little rounding, very subtle stuff. I'm just fussing myself at this point, trying to get the details right. All in all, by around this point, I'm feeling pretty good. Yeah. So another aspect of this that is possible, that I have done sometimes or will do on certain versions, is instead of setting the internal objects to multiply, you can sandwich them between layers of jelly. So there's a jelly layer underneath it and a jelly layer on top of it, and you can see I'm sliding the opacity forwards and backwards. And that will make the jelly seem thicker or more opaque. You can play with different layer modes, try and get a different effect out of it, but by and large I've actually found that if I leave the jelly at the back and put the internal elements on top of it, but set them to multiply, that tends to work pretty well. And it's a pretty flexible system. Another tool that I'll use sometimes, just again to show depth, is I'll use darker bubbles in addition to the light ones. Again, that helps to create a little bit more depth within the jelly itself. I'm feeling like the shadows are a little bit dark and don't have as much bounce light and subsurface scattering as I want, so I'm brushing a little bit of light into the areas where the shadows are pooling, just to give it that kind of luminous quality that I like. Fussing with some finishing touches, adding a little brightness to those exterior elements. I think we're good. So, to review a few key aspects of the process. No hard corners. Because of the way jelly is, generally speaking, you want to avoid anything that looks like it's pinching. When you color it, use soft color and diffuse gradients. That tells you a lot more about the nature of jelly and the light that travels across it. Things kind of blend into each other. The shines show your flow of the shapes and the dimension of the jelly. Find the highest part of the round shapes and add a highlight right there. Don't over highlight, find a good balance. Layer modes like multiply will set objects inside the jelly. Play with those layer modes a little bit. Hard light, soft light, overlay, and multiply can be very useful. Bubbles for depth. A few little bubbles in front of and behind the objects will set them in space. And never don't bounce light. Wherever there's shadows, cut them with a little bit of light bouncing around from the inside on the opposite side of the shines. And there you go. That's your jelly.